When I first encountered my real-life situation, I thought that this issue, this fervent disagreement between pro-abortion and anti-abortion supporters, is so deeply rooted in core ideals, namely ethics and emotional connection, that it will always be a sensitive topic for discussion. It makes me feel a little bit awed by the sheer depth or force of these values people hold, but also somewhat disturbed because they can cloud someone's judgment and cause them to believe the worst about others if they don't hold the same beliefs. This real-life situation occurred down the street from my school. There were a bunch of anti-abortion activists standing at a street corner near restaurants kids go to for lunch. Most of the signs were appropriate and only contained text, but the biggest one was a very graphic picture of a fetus that had been aborted, quite bloody and horrific according to eyewitness accounts. A multitude of students took it upon themselves to confront the adults holding the sign, and essentially said that while they were all for freedom of speech, there's a line that you just don't cross, and holding up a sign like that where young children can see it definitely crosses it. They made the argument that it could be traumatizing and fear-inducing, and when the adults refused to lower the sign, students tore it up. Eventually, the police arrived and the matter was dealt with more civilly. There are limits on what can be known about this real-life situation because none of us were there and cannot explain precisely what happened, nor the emotions or drives that caused individuals involved to behave the way they did. It is also a second-hand account, so minor details may not be accurate, though the major and most important ones are, and therefore may be analyzed. This line of thinking led me to develop my knowledge question, as I realized that emotion was one of the main motivators driving the actions in the real-life situation, and wanted to focus on it as a driving force behind developing different perspectives more generally. The knowledge question I eventually developed was, how do emotion and sensory perception serve as driving forces behind the development of different perspectives? It relates to my real-life situation because the protesters obviously had very strong emotions regarding the act of getting an abortion, while the students, though not against freedom of speech, were horrified by the sign that was considered acceptable in the eyes of the activists. Also, the sign was reportedly quite huge and thereby assaulted one's senses. Students saw it and heard the adults protesting, so their senses were awash with information that triggered visceral emotions that caused a confrontation. The areas of knowledge my question encompasses are ethics and psychology. Ethics relates to it because the students specifically believed showing a sign that graphic about such a sensitive topic was unethical because it could traumatize those who view it. This is where psychology comes in, because when a young, susceptible mind encounters such a visual, harsh message, it could easily affect the way they view the topic of abortion from now on. Every time they hear the word, that image will pop into their heads and immediately create a negative reaction to it. In this instance, it has successfully created a schema, or a pattern of thought that organizes categories of information in the mind based on one's memories and experiences. Because of this, memory is a very important way of knowing involved in this real-life situation, along with emotion and sensory perception, as it is the memory of the event and the emotions associated with it that results in any sort of reaction to it at all. Sensory perception's role in creating different perspectives and opinions held by people is in it establishing a basis on which emotions and ideals are founded. You require sight, smell, hearing, etc. in order to process events fully and commit them to memory. Without them, there would be no memory and therefore no emotional connection to an experience, which is what opinions are built upon. For example, I personally witnessed a girl I had just met attempt suicide because she was desperate to escape her extremely abusive father and submissive mother. I remember exactly how red her blood was, how it smelled, how it looked on the concrete as rain began to wash it away. If I hadn't seen it, experienced it with my own senses, the impact it had on me would have been reduced tenfold, and the emotions it brought up would have been lessened significantly, as I would have no real concept of the event in my mind. Another way to look at the role of sensory perception and emotion in creating perspectives is to consider that emotions can be felt regarding an event you never witnessed. A friend of mine has been researching the role of comfort women, or prostitutes, in the history of Japan, and even though what these women went through was never experienced personally by her, she is extremely passionate about it and often moved to tears when discussing the more harsh realities of what these women went through. So, in one instance, sensory perception is key to developing emotions that create a certain perspective in a person, while in the other, it is not required to instill empathy or an emotional reaction that results in an equally strong perspective on something. However, the agreed upon thing that both these views support is that emotion is key in developing a perspective on something because it influences your entire opinion on whatever matter is at hand. Psychologically, the idea behind the sign was to deter women from having an abortion by showing them the realities of an aborted fetus. The activists wanted to instill a sense of empathy in viewers so that they would never do that to an unborn baby themselves. In the minds of the students, however, the sign was unnecessarily graphic and could cause serious psychological trauma in young girls because the mention of abortion from then on would remind them of that picture, of the fear that would come with an abortion and the shame associated with it as well. This would create a schema which would influence their entire perspective on how the world works, albeit minutely. An example of this occurring would be in cases of PTSD. My late grandfather suffered from this as he served as a spy in World War II, and he described it as being like flashes of sensory memory. He would be walking down the street, and someone could be working in their garage, and he would hear a drill or a hammer or some loud noise, and suddenly he would feel barbed wire dinging into his back, see planes overhead that were not there, and hear explosions all around him because an experience or multiple experiences left him with a schema he could never get rid of. The students were arguing that the same could happen to the girls who saw that sign, of course on a lesser scale, but severe enough to affect them mentally. However, on the other side of this idea is the ability to reason your way out of such an emotional psychological reaction in a logical way. For example, I have had several extremely emotionally traumatizing events that have landed me in the hospital, and as a result, really hate them a great deal. Despite this, I realize that they serve a very good purpose, and just because my experiences with them have been negative to the extreme, doesn't mean that others don't receive life-changing treatments or positive experiences there as well. I am able to work through my schema and disdain for hospitals and specifically doctors there because I know others don't have the same perspective that I do. This was most likely the thought process behind the protesters' actions. The sign was not meant to cause psychological harm, but to promote negativity in response to the idea of an abortion in a reasonable fashion. The culmination of both these ideas is that schemas caused by certain experiences can either completely determine behavior driven by emotion or by reason. Whether or not the schema is emotionally damaging enough to override reason is the real dilemma. And in the real-life situation, the protesters believed it wasn't, while the students thought otherwise, resulting in strongly differing perspectives on the matter. Emotion and sensory perception serve as the driving forces behind developing different perspectives on a topic by providing us with information that must be used to draw a conclusion about a certain event or circumstance. Sensory perception gives us raw data to process, such as sights, sound, smells, touches, etc., and these often trigger emotions because they are linked to specific memories in your mind, i.e., schemas. A possible flaw in this conclusion is that you can feel very strongly about things you have never personally experienced, and while emotion is a driving force in developing a perspective in this instance, sensory perception is not. Also, in certain circumstances, emotional responses caused by a reaction to sensations can be undermined by reason and logical thought processing. This instance has sensory perception as a driving force behind creating perspectives, but emotion has now been canceled out by reason. In my real-life situation, sensory perception was used by the students when they saw the enormous sign depicting an aborted fetus. Because it was very large, they couldn't miss it, and they also heard the shoutings of the protesters. This information was sent to their brains and caused a visceral emotional response that included anger, disgust, and indignation because they believed, based on personal experiences as a teenager, that the sign would cause harm to other children by relating abortion to something horrific. This would then cause a schema to develop in the mind that would make abortion forever relatable to this event and the negative feelings associated with it. This conclusion also helps to explain my personal reaction to the smell of blood. It immediately brings me back to the moment when I watched a girl I just met slit her wrists outside while it was raining, and it has helped me shape my perspective on both abuse and suicide. Because of the helplessness I felt in the moment and the indescribable pity I had for the girl, my perspective is that there are certain situations that merit extreme actions, and that the choice to do what you want with your own life should never be taken from you. But this does not necessarily mean that other people's perspectives are the same as mine. To wrap up, I'd like to say that all situations and opinions presented here are not considered right nor wrong, but were used merely for their convenience in fitting the topic I chose for my presentation.